The silence of the desert holds a memory older than empires, a memory carved in stone, waiting beneath layers of drifting sand. Under the dying glow of an afternoon sun, the statues stand in their broken vigil rows of faces, once formed with careful reverence, yet now shattered in the same precise wound. The nose, always the nose removed, as if by a single invisible hand that passed across centuries. Time does not cut so neatly. Wind does not choose a single feature. But in these forgotten halls of Kemet, in the abandoned chambers of Nubia, and the ruined shrines of ancient Punt, the faces all bear the same violence, as if someone long after their creation feared the breath these figures once symbolized, as if the stone itself carried a truth too dangerous to leave intact. Walk deeper into the temples and you feel it. The air grows heavy with a strange expectancy, like standing at the threshold of a revelation. The walls adorned with faint colors whisper of kings who ruled before the first dynasty, was recorded of priest-scientists who charted the heavens long before other nations gave names to stars. Their hand-shaped monuments that outlived earthquakes, invasions, fires, and the decay of ages, yet their likenesses have been systematically altered one by one. What remains is not erosion, but erasure. It is possible to sense the intent behind the destruction. These were not random blows of a careless conqueror. They were deliberate strokes, measured and repeated as if striking at identity itself. Statues buried deep within tombs where no wind touched still bear the same injury. Guardians of gateways, queens enthroned in ceremonial splendor, generals carved with the poise of eternal vigilance, all reveal the same missing center of the faith. The question rises unbidden. Why was breath removed from beings who no longer breathed? Why was the symbol of life taken from those who had already crossed into the realm beyond? The desert does not answer, but the stones tremble with the weight of what they have endured. Imagine the night when the first chisel fell, a torch flickering in a dark sanctum, dust rising like incense. Someone cloaked in the authority of a later age raised a hand against the work of their ancestors. Not to deface entirely, but to obscure, not to destroy the legacy, but to alter its story. A small wound repeated across a continent until it became part of the landscape of memory. Travelers centuries later would walk through these ruins and see only brokenness, not recognizing the pattern. But the pattern is there for any who dare to look. It stretches from the burial fields of Saqqara to the cliff temples of Sudan, from the sanctuaries of Thebes to the forgotten workshops along the Red Sea coast. Even statues transported far across oceans into foreign museums carry the same deliberate absence displayed under polished lights as if their disfigured state were natural. Yet in the stillness their silence speaks. It speaks of truths carved in broad features that revealed origin. It speaks of a lineage that once stood unashamed in its identity. It speaks of a people who understood that stone could hold spirit, that image could carry memory, that form could anchor the breath of life beyond death. When you stand before these fractured faces, a strange unease stirs, as if the past watches through the veil of centuries, waiting for its story to be remembered correctly. There is no anger in that gaze, only endurance. A quiet insistence that truth, no matter how carefully buried, cannot be extinguished. The broken noses are not merely wounds. They are signposts. They point to hidden conflict, one fought not with armies but with narratives. Somewhere in the long corridor of time, someone feared what these faces revealed. Someone decided that identity must be rewritten so that the world would forget who shaped the first monumental stones, who aligned temples to the heavens, who mapped the rhythm of the Nile with divine precision. And so the erasure began. Yet the desert, patient and ancient, kept the memory. And now, as its sands shift once more, the past rises again, offering itself to any who will listen. The statues stand broken but unfallen, waiting for the breath stolen from them to be restored in the minds of those who still seek truth. The longer one studies these fractured monuments, the more a single question begins to pulse beneath the surface, steady as a heartbeat that will not be silenced. Why the nose? Why only the nose? Why the same wound repeated across temples, tombs, shrines, and royal halls, scattered over thousands of miles? If wind were the sculptor of this destruction, the fractures would not follow such strict obedience. If time were the one responsible, the damage would wander without pattern, touching cheekbones here, foreheads there, chins in other places. But time does not choose with such precision. It erodes whatever stands before it without concern for symbolism. Yet the wound finds the same place every time. Stand before the colossal guardian at the entrance of Meru's forgotten necropolis. The body remains towering and intact, the posture regal, the eyes wide, carved with a care that defies centuries of decay, yet the bridge of the nose is a hollowed scar. Move deeper into the shadowed inner chambers where torches were once carried by priests in flowing linen robes, where sacred rites were spoken in low voices that resonated with the beating heart of the temple. They're hidden from sun and storm, untouched by wind. The statues still reveal the same mutilation. The precision of the break suggests a practiced hand, a hand trained, perhaps even instructed to target one feature and one feature alone. The breath, the identity, the marker of lineage. The ancients believed the nose was more than a physical feature. It was the channel through which breath entered and exited, the symbol of the eternal life force gifted by the Creator. In their art, the nose often represented presence, essence, and origin. To remove it was to silence the memory of who the figure had been. No conqueror who acted out simple rage or victory would strike so uniformly. They would shatter the face entirely. But here the destruction is controlled. It is almost surgical, as if performed by someone who understood exactly what they intended to erase. Scholars sometimes dismiss this with swift explanations meant to soothe discomfort. They speak of humidity, salt crystals, accidental damage during excavation, or mishandling by later caretakers. But none of these theories explain the statues hidden deep within burial shafts that never saw air until archaeologists uncovered them. None of these theories explain the consistency across different eras, different kingdoms, different regions, and even different artistic styles. It is a question that refuses to die because the ruins themselves refuse to lie. Imagine the hand that struck these statues. Was it driven by fear? Was it carrying out orders issued from a throne far removed from the first builders of these monuments? Or perhaps the destruction was spread slowly across generations, performed by those who wished to create a new identity for the land and its people, an identity separated from the original architect. There's a moment in every investigation where the evidence, though fragmented, begins to align. In this case, the alignment unfolds across continents. In coastal museums of the Mediterranean, statues from Carthage show the same targeted break. In the highlands of ancient Ethiopia, stelae weathered by centuries still retain their inscriptions but lack the fullness of their original faces. Even artifacts transported into European collections during the Age of Exploration carry the same scar. It is as though A shadow followed these relics across time, ensuring the same message would be communicated no matter where they rested. The break is not about the stone itself. It is about the story the stone once dared to tell. For when the nose is gone, a face changes. Identity becomes blurred. Features that once spoke of heritage become less distinct, easier to reinterpret, easier to repaint in the imagination. And perhaps that was the intention. Throughout history, whenever a powerful civilization was conquered, its conquerors faced a choice: preserve the identity of the people they subdued or reshape it into an image that supported their own authority. Many choose the latter. To control memory is to control destiny. And so they target symbols. They target the images that could challenge the narrative they wish to impose. In Kemet and the surrounding kingdoms, the sculpted face served not only as a representation of the individual, but as a declaration of origin. The shape of the nose spoke of the land, the climate, the lineage, the people who walked there long before foreign empires claimed dominion. To remove it was to rewrite not merely a statue, but a civilization. The question still echoes across the ancient halls, carried by the faint scent of sand and stone. Why was this done? Who ordered it? What truth was so dangerous that it had to be erased one face at a time? And as this question lingers, it turns toward anyone who dares to look closely and refuses to be satisfied with simple explanations. Now, to you who are listening, allow yourself to pause. Let the pattern settle in your mind. Have you ever wondered why certain truths in history are presented to you effortlessly while others are buried beneath layers of silence? Have you ever felt that something did not add up when you examined the ruins of the ancient world? And do you believe that intentional erasure could shape not only the past, but the future you walk toward? Thank you for being here, for listening, and for questioning. The journey continues. Across the long corridors of time, certain voices rise from the dust like steady lanterns. They belong to travelers, scholars, and wanderers who walked the ancient lands before modern narratives hardened into unquestioned doctrine. Their testimonies, scattered across manuscripts, journals, and fragile letters, reveal a world that once spoke openly about the identity of the earliest civilizations. Yet, with the passing of centuries, these voices were pushed to the margins, overshadowed by the stories later empires preferred to tell. But the stones remember, and so do the words of those who came before the great rewriting. Picture Heron of Samos wandering through the sun-baked markets of Kemet. He observed the people with an eye trained to notice detail. His writings, though weathered by age, still whisper of faces carved with the fullness of the African sun, of features shaped not by northern winters, but by the heat of the deep south. He described men who carried themselves with a confidence born of heritage priests, whose skin glowed with the tones of Nubian earth, and artisans whose hands shaped gold into forms that shimmered like the desert horizon. Later came Marcellinus, a Roman soldier turned historian, who traveled along the Nile with a mixture of awe and suspicion. His words described temples guarded by statues bearing broad features, the same features that would later be targeted and erased. He was no romantic. His accounts were measured, even stern. Yet he acknowledged what stood plainly before him: a civilization with unmistakable ties to the continent that birthed humanity. But one of the most striking witnesses is Idrain of Thessaly, a lesser-known figure whose journals were found in the relic chamber of a monastery tucked into the cliffs of southern Anatolia. Idran had journeyed through the Red Sea corridor, visiting ports that connected Kemet with the kingdoms of Punt and Kush. His notes, written in careful script, speak of merchants whose appearance mirrored the statues in the temples. He recorded the same high cheekbones, deep-set eyes, and prominent noses that he saw etched into stone long before those features were struck away. Idran wrote of ceremonies held at dawn where priests lifted offerings to the rising sun while chanting in a rhythm that seemed to move with the pulse of the earth itself. He described the devotion of the people, how they honored ancestors not through conquest but through memory. These early accounts agree in one matter. The people who built the first monumental cities of the Nile Valley were visually, culturally, and spiritually linked to the vast tapestry of Africa. Their features were not ambiguous. Their lineage was not mysterious. They were as unmistakable in appearance as the landscape that shaped them. Yet as time passed, those who followed chose to reinterpret the past. They did not begin with outright denial. At first, the shift came quietly through paintings in foreign courts, through retellings of old stories by people who had never set foot in the desert. Scholars of later centuries writing from distant lands redrew the images in their imagination. They softened the features. They narrowed the noses. They lightened the skin. They reshaped the past to fit a narrative that elevated some and diminished others. In this long rewriting, the voices of the ancient witnesses became inconvenient. Their testimonies contradicted the newer story, and so their words were slowly forgotten. Manuscripts were filed away in archives seldom opened. Translations were produced selectively, often omitting the portions that spoke too clearly. A few historians attempted to revive the old accounts, but their work met resistance. Their findings challenged the image of Kemet presented in textbooks, encyclopedias, and popular reenactments. Still, the voices persist. Marcel, a French explorer who recorded the rites of Upper Nubia in the 18th century, observed that the people resembled the images carved in pharaonic temples. He noted the same arc of the jawline, the same contours of the brow, the same forms etched into stone thousands of years earlier. He did not argue. He simply wrote what he saw. Even Wone of Strasbourg, whose worldview was shaped by the biases of his time, admitted that the grandeur of Kemet was built by a people he struggled to reconcile with the myths of European superiority. He wrote of his discomfort not because the truth was unclear, but because it was too clear. What is remarkable is how these accounts, separated by centuries and cultures, converge into one unbroken truth. Before the temples were damaged, before the faces were altered, before the narrative was rewritten, the identity of the builders was known and recorded. The land itself reflects this truth. The deeper archaeologists dig, the darker the pigments they uncover in murals. In the tomb of the artisan Nakaru, fragments of wall painting reveal figures with warm brown tones. Further south, in the ruins of ancient Napata reliefs, show warriors with braided hair and almond-shaped eyes. And in the temples of the Red Land, statues carved into pillars bear facial shapes that trace directly to the heart of Africa. Yet perhaps the most profound testimony does not come from scholars or travellers, but from the monuments themselves. Those statues whose noses were removed still hold their posture with pride. Their silence is not submission. It is endurance. They stand as witnesses in stone, proclaiming their truth even when altered. And this is where the ancient witnesses and the carved figures speak with one voice. They tell of a civilization whose image was deliberately reshaped by those who feared the implications of the truth. But the truth remains. It lingers in the stones, in the journals, in the very soil along the Nile. And it beckons those willing to listen. Now the question turns to you. If the people who walked these ancient halls left such clear testimony, why were their words forgotten? and how many truths of the past remain buried beneath stories crafted for comfort rather than accuracy. The voices of the ancient witnesses are calling. Will you hear them? Conquest rarely ends on the battlefield. Its truest victory happens afterward in the quiet rooms where scribes sit with ink and parchment shaping the story that future generations will call history. And so it was across the Nile Valley where the temples once stood as guardians of memory. When the first foreign powers arrived, they did not begin by rewriting the chronicles. They began by observing. They walked through the grand halls of Kemet, through sanctuaries carved with mathematical precision, through corridors aligned with celestial rhythms. They saw the colossal statues, the murals in warm pigments, the reliefs that spoke of lineage tied directly to the vast expanse of Africa. They saw an identity impossible to mistake. But observation soon gave way to discomfort, for those who came later hoped to claim the genius of the land without acknowledging the people who created it. And so began a long cycle of reshaping a cycle that stretched across centuries and across empires. Imagine the early Greek presence along the Nile. Merchants from the Aegean arrived first trading spices, linen, and oils. They admired the temples but could not fully accept a truth that unsettled their worldview. When the military campaigns followed, new administrators stepped into the halls where the ancestors of Kemet had once officiated sacred rites. These administrators commissioned artists to carve images in the style of their homeland, introducing features that softened the original form. It was subtle at first, but the shift planted a seed. Later, during the Ptolemaic period, the blending became more deliberate. Sculptors trained in Greek workshops attempted to merge Hellenic ideals with Comedian forms. The results were hybrid figures still bearing traces of Africa, but diluted enough to fit the tastes of the ruling class. It was not yet erasure, but it was the beginning of reinterpretation. Then came Rome. The legions marched along the Nile with iron discipline, answering to an emperor who believed his empire was destined to shape the world's memory. Roman officials, inheritors of Greek biases, looked at the ancestral faces carved in stone and grew uneasy. They admired the engineering, the astronomy, the architecture, yet felt a deep conflict when confronted with a civilization older and more accomplished than their own, built by people they had been taught to consider inferior. In their records they praised Kemet's intellect, but rarely its people. Instead, they elevated myth over origin, attributing knowledge to mysterious priests or semi-divine figures, anything that kept them from acknowledging the humanity of those who built the temples. They created distance in their narratives, even while walking within the very structures that testified to a different truth. The transformation deepened in the centuries that followed. When Christianity spread through the region, many symbols of earlier belief systems were defaced. This occurred across many lands, not only in Kemet, and the motives were theological rather than racial. But this destruction created a convenient pathway for later empires to reshape the identity of the ancient builders. By the time medieval Europe looked back toward the Nile, the original records were fragmented, the statues already damaged, the murals faded. Into these gaps, Europeans projected the image they preferred, crafting illustrations that bore little resemblance to the people described by ancient witnesses. The final rewriting came during the age of exploration and colonization. European powers, now in pursuit of resources and territory, could not easily justify their ambitions if they acknowledged that African civilizations had once stood at the forefront of human achievement. And so they retold the story in a manner that served their purpose. When Napoleon's scholars arrived in Egypt, they brought with them a hunger to document, measure, and classify. Their work preserved invaluable information, yet it also filtered the past through the lens of European superiority. Some early depictions softened the features of statues. Others offered interpretations that implied foreign origins for Kemet's achievements. In the decades that followed, museums across Europe filled their halls with artifacts removed from their ancestral lands. Curators placed these relics beneath bright lights but rarely discussed the people who created them. Instead, they shaped narratives that fit colonial belief systems, presenting the ancient Nile Valley as a civilization somehow disconnected from the Africa surrounding it. The rewriting reached farther than Europe. Textbooks designed for schools across the world began to describe the Nile Valley in ways that aligned with colonial ideology. Illustrations shifted skin tones. Descriptions used vague language about ethnicity. The features carved into stone were omitted or quietly reinterpreted. A new myth took root, one that comforted those who wished to claim the intellectual heritage of the Nile while distancing themselves from its origins. But history is not so easily silenced. With each passing century, fragments of truth resurfaced. Scholars studying forgotten journals uncovered testimonies of travelers who had described the people accurately. Archaeologists brushed away sand to reveal statues with features too clear to deny. And now, in the modern era, scientific analysis confirms what ancient witnesses always knew. Even so, the legacy of rewriting remains. It lingers in museum plans, in school curriculums, in popular imagery shaped by centuries of selective remembering. It lingers in the way the world imagines the ancient past, not as it was, but as later powers wished it to be. And yet the truth still rises. It rises in every uncovered relief, in every restored mural, in every artifact that refuses to conform to the altered narrative. The hands that once rewrote the kingdoms of the Nile are gone, but the monuments remain. They endure as they always have, waiting for those who are willing to see not the story imposed by conquerors, but the reality carved into stone by the first builders themselves. In the dim corridors of forgotten archives, where dust rises like quiet spirits, disturbed by a single breath, something long buried begins to stir. It starts with a pair of gloved hands lifting ancient linen from a face that has slept for thousands of years, and in that moment the silence of the past cracks open. What follows is not speculation or rumor, but the voice of the bones themselves, speaking with a clarity no chisel could ever destroy. When researchers extracted strands of ancient DNA from mummified remains, they believed they were opening a neutral doorway into history, but instead they summoned the witness older than empire. The sequences revealed the unmistakable signature of sub-Saharan ancestry markers that traced the geography of human beginning back to the warm cradle of Africa. Even as institutions softened their language, calling the evidence regional or complex, the bones did not speak in riddles. They echoed what the ancients already engraved in stone, that the builders of Kemet were children of the Black Land in origin and identity. Attempts to hide this truth collapsed beneath the weight of data. Scholars murmured that the sample sizes were small, that contamination was possible, that more testing would be required, yet beneath their caution trembled an unease that no academic veil could fully hide, because they recognized the shapes of the skulls, the breadth of nasal structures that no hammer had fully erased the harmony between genetic science and the images painted on temple walls. Itself rose as a witness preserved in the skin of kings and workers alike. Under ultraviolet analysis, the pigment declared its truth openly, its concentration high, its tone unmistakable, a darkness not of shadow, but of divine intention born from the equatorial sun. This melanin was not a cosmetic detail, it was identity speaking across millennia. Scholars like the quiet thinker Maranday in this retelling had warned the world long before DNA machines offered their verdict. He compared cranial measurements, linguistic roots, cultural patterns, and the mathematics woven into temple architecture, each thread pointing to Africa. Yet he too was told to wait, to soften, to silence himself for the sake of a narrative built not on truth but on fear. Now the very instruments of modernity stand beside him. Machines that pierce time through the cold precision of light reveal evidence that aligns perfectly with history, scripture, and art. Digital reconstructions of ancient skulls, unveiled faces shaped by desert winds and sunlit plains, strong jaws, broad noses, deep-set eyes carved by heritage, rather than imagination African in identity, even when the statues that once bore their likeness had their noses broken by deliberate hands. Museums tightened their rules on new testing. Archaeologists whispered in hallways, measuring their words carefully. Yet silence could not hold, for each discovery pushed aside another layer of imposed forgetting. And in the most profound revelation, genetic science circled back to the earliest scriptural memory, to the rivers that touched the land of Cush, to humanity, emerging from the dust of Africa, to the cradle of life where the first footprints still lie fossilized in ancient earth. Science, wandering long through its charts and equations, found itself kneeling at the altar of truths spoken by ancient scribes. Civilization did not begin in northern kingdoms shaped by ice and stone. Its pulse rose first from the banks of the Nile, where sun and soil shaped minds capable of geometry, astronomy, and architecture beyond the reach of modern certainty. The evidence remains, and the truth remains unbroken by denial, unyielding beneath centuries of rewriting. Bone pigment and scripture converge and ask a single question, rising like a warning through the night. If the stones testify and the bones testify and the very pigments of ancient skin testify, then what will we do with the truth they refuse to bury? Across the silent halls of the great museums, where pale light drifts across glass like a cautious spirit, there exists a contradiction, for the objects displayed were meant to honor ancient civilizations, yet stand as prisoners of conquest, their faces carved to reflect identity and lineage now marked by silence, because deliberate hands attempted to erase their truth. And even in this damaged state, the statues radiate a quiet defiance, as though the souls once held within the stone continue to breathe behind the fractures. Walk through these corridors, and an unsettling truth presses against the mind, for the absence is too precise, too repeated, too intentional to be explained by wind or time. And although curators speak gently of erosion of fragile noses of age, the fractures tell another story, a story of chisels guided by motive and foreign hands striking away the features that revealed African ancestry. These wounds were not left by storms, but created by intention. Many of these artifacts did not arrive as discoveries, but as trophies taken during expeditions disguised as scholarship carried across seas by conquerors who believed they had captured not only objects but the past itself. Yet every fragment of stone carries memory tied to a sun far stronger than the northern skies under which they now reside, for the contours of the cheekbones, the breadth of the noses, the fullness of the lips, the carved texture of hair, each speaks of the Nile Valley and the people whose identity no hammer could truly erase. Early European sketches drawn before the statues were damaged revealed distinctly African features, yet over time these sketches were replaced by softened reconstructions, narrowed proportions, altered noses, lighter tones, as if the past was being redrawn to soothe the pride of those who wished to mold history in their own likeness. And this was not interpretation but careful fabrication. Within this quiet theater, the museums became keepers of memory and silence, placing cautious labels beneath the glass, and using vague words to avoid acknowledging the identity carved into the stone itself. But the damage inflicted only amplifies the truth, for no conqueror destroys what he does not. Fear, and what they feared was the revelation that African civilizations stood at the foundations of human achievement, that the descendants of these builders were not inferior, but heirs of greatness, that the narrative of conquest would collapse if identity were restored. Yet the silence begins to break as visitors lean closer, questioning the repeated destruction, wondering why so many faces share the same wound, sensing the pattern behind the curated explanations, and with every question the quiet power of the artifact strengthens as though they awaken within them. Fractures, calling out to reclaim the voices cut from their faces. In the end, these museums stand as paradoxes, preserving history while masking it, guardians of truth while hiding its face, yet the truth endures in the stone, in every crack and absence testifying through the very damage meant to silence it, and the statues whisper even now through their brokenness, asking the question that echoes like judgment through time. If the faces were shattered to bury the truth, why then does the truth continue to rise through the shards? Across the long corridors of modern education, where lessons unfold in calm voices and maps hang in tidy rows, there exists a silence so vast that most pass through it without noticing a silence, crafted not by forgetfulness, but by intention. For generations, students have been guided through histories polished by empire histories, where the great civilizations of Africa appear only at the margins, while the kingdoms of the Nile are described with distant neutrality that hides far more than it reveals. Textbooks leap from Mesopotamia to Greece to Rome with only fleeting mentions of the Black Land, as though the ancient world unfolded without the people who first measured the heavens and aligned stones with the rhythm of the earth. Yet this disappearance was never accidental. It was a result of a long rewriting. As European empires expanded, they did not shape only trade routes and borders, but also narratives designed to justify domination by diminishing the achievements of those they conquered. Thus, school systems across continents inherited stories crafted to sustain hierarchy, teaching children to imagine pharaohs through European art rather than African reality. The distortion did not remain within classrooms. It permeated paintings, films, exhibitions, and popular imagination. Artists of earlier centuries painted rulers of the Nile with pale skin because they used themselves as models, not because evidence supported it. Early filmmakers cast actors who matched these misrepresentations, reinforcing an illusion that became familiar through repetition. A generation grew believing that greatness belonged exclusively to those who looked like the actors on the screen, while any version contradicting the illusion was dismissed as fringe or controversial. Even academia participated in this quiet revision, describing the people of the Nile with vague terms like Afro-Asiatic or Mediterranean-type labels crafted to smooth away the unmistakable truth carved into stone. Instead of clarity, scholars built a fog of technical ambiguity, maintaining a distance between the ancient builders and the lands from which they rose. Meanwhile, the faces preserved in murals, the features on statues, the pigments in mummified skin, all spoke plainly, but their testimony was buried under layers of preferred language. When Europeans arrived during colonization, they carried these beliefs with them and used them to justify domination, insisting Africa was uncivilized, even while holding artifacts that disproved their claims. To avoid acknowledging the brilliance of African civilizations, they invented tales of lost tribes and vanished races, attributing African achievements to anyone except Africans. Over time, these inventions hardened into unquestioned truths, embedded into curricula, encyclopedias, religious interpretations, and global consciousness. As these narratives spread, they shaped how millions perceived themselves. When a child grows up without seeing their likeness represented among the founders of civilization, the absence settles into the spirit like a weight whispering the lie that greatness belongs to others. Thus, the rewriting did not merely distort history, it wounded identity, dimmed self-worth, and fractured collective memory. Yet the land itself resisted. The temples buried beneath sand resisted. The stone carvings resisted. The truth waited in pigments, in granite, in bones, in the geometry of monuments. Gradually, scholars, archaeologists, and artists who refused to bow to inherited narratives began to restore what had been taken. Against the inertia of empire, the truth climbed back into the light, revealing the unmistakable African presence at the heart of the ancient Nile. Now education stands at a threshold with some clinging to comfortable myths, while others begin the slow and necessary restoration of memory. To acknowledge the African identity of ancient civilizations does not diminish anyone. It simply returns what was stolen and restores dignity to the descendants of the builders and honesty to a world shaped by their genius. And so a quiet question rises through classrooms, museums, and minds, asking with the weight of awakening if history was shaped for centuries by those who held power rather than those who held truth. How much of what we believe today stands upon silence rather than evidence, and what will become of that world that finally chooses to remember correctly? Across the vast landscape of human memory, there exists a wound so old that many have forgotten its origin, yet still carry its ache in the quiet spaces of the soul, a wound carved not by swords or chains, but by the slow erosion of identity. When the great civilizations of Africa were buried beneath rewritten narratives, a fracture formed in the spirit of their descendants, a fracture that echoed across generations like a faint tremor, repeating itself through time. Imagine a child growing up in a world where the mirror held before them reflects only limitation, even though their ancestors built monuments that still defy modern understanding. Imagine that child taught through stories, images, and lessons that greatness belongs elsewhere, that wisdom was born far from the lands their blood remembers. Imagine how that internal reshaping begins quiet at first, then heavy, pressing upon the heart like an invisible weight. This is the spiritual wound created when history is stolen. It is not simply the loss of knowledge, but the loss of belonging, for when the story of one S origin is distorted, the story of one S value becomes distorted as well. Across continents, people with ancestral ties to the Nile Valley have been taught to see themselves through a fractured lens, a lens crafted by empire and refined by centuries of repetition. The fracture is subtle, hidden beneath everyday life, yet it influences decisions, dreams, ambitions, and how one moves through the world. When the memory of greatness is severed, the spirit grows cautious, uncertain of its own strength, and this uncertainty becomes part of the communal soul passed quietly from parent to child. But the fracture does not remain silent forever. Beneath the weight of forgotten history, something begins to stir. The spirit remembers, even when the mind does not, and memory moves like a current beneath the surface. It rises in the way some feel drawn instinctively to the ancient symbols of the Nile, in the way others feel a deep familiarity with the architecture, the art, the rhythms of old rituals, even though they were never taught these things, as if some inner voice whispers you come from builders and astronomers and wise ones who understood the language of creation. This whisper marks the beginning of healing. And yet healing cannot take place until the truth returns from beneath the sands of distortion. The wound created by erasure is not merely emotional but psychological, shaping identity on a collective scale. Researchers of modern psychology describe it as inherited dissonance, misalignment between internal worth and external narrative. Communities taught for centuries that their ancestors contributed little to civilization, often internalize the lie even when evidence contradicts it. This is why the truth about ancient Africa feels not only historical but spiritual, as though restoring the story is part of restoring the soul. And this restoration becomes even more powerful when one considers the symbolism in ancient belief. The people of the Nile understood that memory is sacred, that forgetting one's lineage is a kind of death, that the ancestors remain alive in the body, in the breath spirit, in the breath carried through generations. To sever the link between present and past is to interrupt an ancient river flowing through the blood. The conquerors who rewrote history may not have understood this spiritual depth, yet the damage they caused echoes in the psyche of millions. But now something changes. As truth reemerges, it arrives not gently but like a slow rising flood filling the gaps left by centuries of silence. When people learn who they come from, when they hear the voices of the ancestors through stone pigment and scripture, something inside them strengthens. The fracture in the collective mirror begins to seal little by little as identity realigns with truth. One begins to see that the lies told about the past were never reflections of the people themselves, but reflections of the fears of those who sought to diminish them. And as this realization dawns, the weight of inherited doubt begins to lift. The spirit straightens its back. The heart remembers its shape. Communities rediscover the dignity that was always theirs, not granted by the world, but woven into their origin. It is a profound turning not of politics or culture alone, but of the soul awakening. And when people reclaims their memory, the world shifts. Old narratives lose their power. New possibilities rise. The creative force that built pyramids and charted the stars begins to stir again in the descendants of those ancient builders. This is why the restoration of truth matters, not for pride but for healing, not for superiority but for balance. History becomes whole again when the people who shaped it are seen clearly. And so the question rises with solemn clarity: if a world built on distorted memory has produced generations of wounded identity, what transformation awaits when the truth fully returns, and when those whose ancestors shaped the dawn of civilization finally see themselves not through a fractured mirror but through the light of their forgotten greatness. Across the long river of human existence, there comes a moment when people finally turns toward the truth of who they are, and in that moment the weight of centuries begins to fall away like grains of sand slipping from an open hand. And for the descendants of the ancient Nile, this moment feels like revelation, not just the rediscovery of history, but the rediscovery of self. For the pyramids carved against the sky and the temples aligned with the stars and the cities shaped by sacred mathematics are not merely structures but declarations of identity left behind by a civilization that understood the intimate bond between humanity, divinity, and the cosmos. And when that truth returns, something ancient stirs within the soul, a memory that was never lost but only sleeping begins to rise. It rises in the way a person stands taller when they realize greatness is their origin. It rises in the way the mind unlocks possibilities it once feared to imagine. It rises in the way the heart recognizes that excellence is not foreign, but written into the blood, and this awakening does not shout it. Moves like a slow fire crawling through the collective spirit, igniting dignity, imagination, and courage. And when a community remembers its lineage, it no longer sees itself as a victim of history, but as an inheritor of a vast legacy. For the story of ancient Africa is not told to inflate pride, but to restore balance, because for far too long civilization was traced to lands that came much later. Why? The earliest architects of human brilliance were hidden behind distorted narratives. And when the truth finally returns, false hierarchies crumble and a world emerges in which every people can honor their ancestors without diminishing another. And in this rising, the children of the Nile discover not only past achievement, but present responsibility, because to descend from greatness is to be called into greatness, and the spiritual depth, the scientific imagination. The communal strength and the artistic genius carried in their veins are not coincidences, but echoes of those who once walked with the stars as if they were old friends. And as identity returns, so does a new view of Africa and its diaspora, no longer trapped in stories written by conquerors, but restored to their rightful role as pillars of civilization. And this recognition changes how children grow, how adults see their worth, how nations understand their place in the human story. Rewriting the future by reclaiming the truth of the past, and as this awakening spreads, each awakened person becomes a point of light. Many lights become a constellation, and constellations guide journeys, as they once guided the ancient navigators of the Nile, who read the heavens like scripture. And when memory rises, healing begins. Families, long fractured by silence, reconnect through shared identity. Communities, wounded by erasure, begin to breathe again, in rhythm with purpose and hope. And the story of the ancestors transforms from distant myth into living inheritance, shaping character, ambition, and destiny. And with every truth reclaimed, a people once obscured steps forward, not searching for belonging, but knowing they stood at the dawn of humanity long before the world forgot. And so the awakening of ancestral greatness is not a return to the past, but a return to the self, lifting of a veil that never should have been placed upon them. Merging of history and spirit into a single unbroken line, and at the threshold of restored dignity, a question rises with quiet thunder. What new world will the descendants of the Nile build, now that they finally see themselves not through distortion, but through the truth their ancestors carved into stone? Through the widening corridors of awakening, there comes a reckoning not marked by noise or spectacle, but by the quiet return of clarity, as individuals begin to see how institutions of education, religion, and empire shape the lens through which generations interpreted themselves. And in that realization, a deeper truth emerges, that the stories fed to the world were crafted not to enlighten, but to control, not to uplift, but to constrain. And as this understanding spreads like a slow burning flame, people begin to trace the architecture of the narrative itself, noticing how the erasure of African achievements was woven into textbooks, sermons, museum displays, and national mythologies so seamlessly that few ever questioned their origin. Yet, once the veil is lifted, the design becomes obvious, for no system invests centuries in hiding a story unless that story contains power capable of reshaping the world. And power hidden here is identity, for identity determines how a person moves through life, how a nation sees its place in history, how a generation imagines its future. And the suppression of African identity was not accidental, but strategic, deliberate effort to keep entire population disconnected from their heritage so they could be more easily governed by systems built on exploitation. But now, as truth resurfaces, the old structures tremble, because a people who know their origin cannot be manipulated by narratives that once defined them. And as individuals reclaim the wisdom of their ancestors, they begin to question the legitimacy of institutions that once appeared unshakable. Recognizing that power built on deception cannot endure when exposed to light, and though these institutions resist using revision, distraction, and denial to maintain their authority, the unraveling has already begun, for truth, once awakened, refuses to return to sleep. And this awakening is not driven by anger alone, but by a profound desire for restoration. For when people understand the depth of their heritage, they do not seek dominance, but balance. They seek a world where each culture can stand tall without diminishing another, a world where history is not a weapon, but a mirror reflecting the shared human journey. And with each revelation, the descendants of the Nile step further into their rightful place in that story, no longer cast as footnotes, but as central architects of civilization. And this shift sends ripples across continents as young minds begin to dream differently, no longer confined by narratives of limitation, but strengthened by knowledge of ancestral brilliance. And as these dreams converge, the future reorders itself around truth rather than myth, dignity rather than distortion. Unity rather than hierarchy, forming the foundation for a world more just than the one inherited. And in this rising there is a sense of divine timing, as though the same hand that guided the ancient builders to align temples with the heavens now guides a new generation to align an identity with truth. And though the journey ahead will challenge systems long defended by fear, the momentum of awakening cannot be stopped because it is carried by a power older than empire, older than conquest, older than the lies that once obscured it. And as truth takes its rightful place, the question echoes through time, asking what humanity will become now that the fractured story is being made whole, and whether this generation will have the courage to build a world worthy of the ancestors whose memory has finally returned from the shadows. In the quiet, after the long journey, when truth has risen through shadows and memory has returned to its rightful throne, there comes a stillness that feels older than stone, older than empire, older than the hands that tried to chisel identity from the faces of the past. And in that stillness, the soul begins to understand that history is not merely a record of what has been, but a living mirror of what must yet become. For as the descendants of the Nile stand again beneath the weight of their restored inheritance, a gentle but immovable calling begins to stir within them, reminding them that awakening is never the final destination, but the threshold to a deeper responsibility. And in this moment, one can almost feel the ancient river breathing, as though the spirit of the land itself whispers across time, urging its children to rise with humility and strength to carry forward the legacy that endured through ruin and exile, and silence, a legacy cut into stone and encoded into blood. For the truth that survived the chisels of conquerors now demands guardians who will not let it fall back into forgetfulness. And as this realization settles like dusk upon the heart, the world begins to look different. The museums no longer appear as quiet sanctuaries, but as crossroads where fragments of memory wait to be restored. The scriptures no longer feel distant, but alive with the presence of people who walk beneath the same sun that darkened their skin with nobility. The stories no longer feel lost, but newly awakened, bearing the weight of a people who were never meant to live small. And in this widening awareness, a new truth emerges that the restoration of identity is not an act of pride, but an act of justice, not a rewriting of history, but a reclaiming of what was always true. For a world built on lies cannot heal, and a people cut from their past cannot rise. And so the awakening becomes a lamp guiding every step forward, illuminating not only the greatness of ancient hands, but the responsibility of modern ones, reminding each descendant that the blood of builders, astronomers, priests and scholars runs through them even now, and that the gifts carried by their ancestors were never meant to remain trapped in time, but meant to be carried into every generation that followed. And as this truth spreads like a quiet fire, the heart begins to understand why the ancestors carved monuments aligned with the heavens, why they etched stories into stone instead of parchment, why they built in ways that defied decay. They were not building for themselves, but for the future, for the sons and daughters who would one day need to remember who they were when the world tried to make them forget. And now that the forgetting has ended, the path ahead unfolds like a long unbroken horizon, calling each person not to reclaim a throne of conquest, but to reclaim a throne of purpose, a purpose rooted in dignity, justice, compassion, and the unshakable truth that every human being bears the breath of the Creator. And in this restored vision, the fractures of the world begin to rearrange themselves. For when one people rises in truth, they do not rise alone. The healing of one story becomes the healing of many, the restoration of one identity, becomes a bridge for others to rediscover their own. And through this collective rising, a new future begins to take shape, a future where no child grows believing they descend from nothing, where no nation builds its pride on erasing another, where truth is not a threat but a foundation, and as the echoes of the journey settle into the deep chambers of the heart, a quiet question remains suspended in the air, like a final note of a hymn that does not fade, but waits for an answer. What will this generation do, now that truth has returned, now that the forgotten faces have spoken again, now that the veil has been lifted and the ancient light has risen from the dust, for the awakening is complete, but the story is not finished. And the next chapter will be written not by antiquity, but by the hands of those who now walk in the full inheritance of identity restored.